This is Jeff Burt. I'm joined by Jasteena Dhillon, who's just given a talk about rule of law, post-conflict reconstruction. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
The first thing I'd like to ask you, what are the kind of opportunities you see in incorporating informal justice mechanisms in state-building approaches? Why is everyone so excited about this idea?
Yeah, I mean, as I was talking about in my talk, what's really, people are excited because they finally think that informal justice is a way to bring communities into the decision-making processes and invest them in the development of their country. So it's exciting because it feels like it's going to be able to reach many more people than we've been able to reach than we have by using formal justice structures like courts, for example, to which many people can't travel to or can't pay the court fees or can't get. So informal justice appears as a way more accessible. I think the other thing is it appears to be accessible not only on the physical transportation front, but also in terms of the literacy-illiteracy divide. So that if it's people sitting around with a tribal elder resolving disputes, more people can express their concerns. They don't have to file papers and very basic things like that. I think the other thing is that we finally believe that there's some historical importance to it. So I just think it's something that we think will bring more stability to a place like Afghanistan, also a place like Sudan.
And some human rights groups, women's groups in particular, express concerns about this approach, saying that it's inherently patriarchal or favors certain groups, doesn't respect human rights. How do you see those objections, and how do you think an informal justice system could be reconciled with issues of human rights?
Yeah, I mean, the issue I think that's of concern is that there's two things. One is that the informal justice system is not well understood by everybody. And I mean everybody outside the local community. Within the local community, the informal justice system is very clear. It is very much embraces all the values which are important in the community. But to us, to the international community, we are unaware of what those values, how important certain values are to people. So for us, it just appears like we are not going to be able to quantify, to judge, to monitor what's going on. So it's an unknown factor thing. Secondly, I think that, and it is true, that there have been informal cases that have been adjudicated in the tribal areas in which some of the outcomes, the punishments that have been the punishments that have been agreed upon have been in contravention to human rights. So when I talk about informal justice mechanisms and valuing them, I don't talk about valuing mechanisms which take people's lives. I mean, as I'm a Canadian, I don't believe the death penalty is a good thing. In America, they do. In Afghanistan, I have the same approach. I don't believe that that is a valid and responsible punishment. The problem we have in those cases is that in the informal justice system, the traditional practices used tend to be based on the Sharia law. And in the Sharia law, punishment by death and other ways is one of the repertoire of punishments available. So where we need to intervene in those situations is not to say the whole tribal justice system or the whole informal justice system is bad, but to look at what elements of it are in contravention of what are internationally accepted values of human rights and work from there. So anytime I've been involved in looking at the informal justice system, I have always talked about certain bottom lines past which we don't go below, or certain lines we don't cross. certain elements. The last thing I would say is that there's an element of understanding which needs to be developed. One is that, and I explained this a little bit in my talk earlier to the others, which was that in the informal justice system, in the traditional justice system, and I'm calling this, okay, just keep in mind I'm using this term which is describing a very diverse subject. So I'll anyway have to qualify everything I'm saying afterwards. That the victim in these systems, so the complainant who comes forward is considered much more important than the accused. So what tends to happen is if you come and accuse me of stealing your car and you go to the tribal elder, I may be asked, I as the person accused may be asked for my input, and I may not. You will definitely be the focus, you, the complainant, the victim. So where this becomes very publicized is in cases of adultery, as I explained. In those cases, the victim is actually never the man or the woman in an adultery situation, because under Sharia law, both the man and the woman are equally culpable in an adultery situation. It's the community or the family who's the victim. So in fact, in a case where adultery is an issue, the man and the woman are completely left out of the case, and then if the jirga decides that an adulterous liaison has happened and they determine the punishment to be something, then you see women being punished. And so that's a very specific outcome. Having said all of this, as in globally, we recognize that violence against women is a problem. We recognize that powerful people in communities tend to be men. And so we recognize that there are abuses of the informal system as there are abuses of the formal system. And so that's where we as the international community need to step in. And that's those cases that definitely need not to happen. Cases in which somebody's power and abuse of power, whether it's because it's a male or whether it's a powerful member of a community, a powerful family, cannot be used to manipulate the informal system. And that's where it's very nuanced, it's very difficult, you know.
Is there a way to come up with sort of general guidelines for state building about which areas of the informal justice system will be most useful? Is it civil law versus criminal law? Is it transitional justice versus being a permanent fixture of the eventual end state justice system? Where do you see the best, least problematic role for informal justice mechanism?
Well, the question you asked me before, when I answer it, I have to preface it by saying one thing. One thing is that there is what we, as the international community, would prefer to be included or not included in terms of informal justice. And there's also what the community who will be using this system would prefer. Looking at the situation on the ground in a place like Afghanistan as an example, or even a place like Sudan, we have to look at what disputes are generally resolved in the informal system, more or less. Now, they tend to be criminal and family cases. That's been the way, and contractual cases to some extent, minus commercial contractual cases. That has just been the way the informal justice system has been used. So it'd be kind of odd to shift those whole body of cases into the formal system if they weren't already in the formal system. So I'm not giving you an answer and saying it should be criminal, it should be family, it shouldn't be criminal, it should be family. I'm saying we need to look at where the body of those cases tend to be resolved. An interesting anecdote would be when I was in Afghanistan in February this year, and I was in the Supreme Court chatting with some of the judges and they're friends of mine, and we were talking, and I basically said, we were talking about judicial review and things like that. When they have a family dispute that they want to resolve, domestic abuse, something that's a small contractual case, even a Supreme Court judge will resolve it in the informal system. So what does that mean? That means that it's part of the way they live in a particular, even the ones who work in the formal justice system. So I just think that's an important fact to note. If I was pressed to give one answer from all the categories you mentioned, of course, I do not want cases in which the outcome of the case, the punishment in a case, will result in the violation of somebody's human rights to be adjudicated under the informal system without safeguards in place. Having said that, the safeguards that are in place in a community system sometimes are even more safe than in a formal system. So the community pressure and the community support, the community's awareness of everyone's watching. So stuff can't really be done in secret there. So it tends to be always a double-edged sword. Hey, if we want to start somewhere, let's start with human rights, and let's start with the basic human rights that we value worldwide, that all countries have signed on to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, including Afghanistan, have ratified all the protocols and conventions, international covenants. So we can start from there. And then sort of try and adjust the informal mechanisms in these countries to adhere to or to not violate rights that are prescribed in those laws. That's a place to start. Afghanistan, as an example, has been always comfortable in resolving commercial disputes in a court. So we keep it like that. Whereas family disputes the community likes to resolve it. So again, we really have to look at what's on the ground and determine better. Now, I know that in Canada, for example, there has been, discussion and debate about bringing these kind of mechanisms, and you're talking more about Sharia law, into, the Canadian context. And that's a different story, because the Canadian context is common law, formal law. And so you're bringing an informal element to a formal element, which isn't indigenous to this area. That's a different debate than imposing something on an area which it's indigenous to. So again, I don't ever talk about these things as if they're two sides of the same coin. To me, it's a completely different debate. So I would have a lot of problems with bringing in informal decision making into a system like Canada, which is very well established in the way it resolves family disputes.
You mentioned in your presentation that this is kind of being approached post hoc as a way to overcome rule of law problems that we're already seeing. Mm-hmm. How do you see it fitting in with the system that we've already created, for example, in Afghanistan?
Well, wow, yeah, I think that we're probably just going to have to continue going along in Afghanistan in this piecemeal way, because it's going to be really hard to stop the approach to development of formal rule of law and restart in a completely different integrated way. What we can do is, we recognize that Afghanistan is a decentralized country with decentralized political decision making. And so in particular areas, people may not vote, but people may want to have more informal decision making structures because that's what's more comfortable to them. And we have to maybe recognize and strengthen those in particular areas. I can bring an example in Canada. We recognize in Canada, in particular areas, in Northwest Territories and Nunavut and other areas, that informal sentencing or circle sentencing and sentencing in different ways would be something relevant to strengthen and worked with it within the formal system. These are things we know. I'm not talking about things we don't know how to do. And so we need to bring that same level of integration and understanding into what we do in Afghanistan. I think our major problem has been that we don't feel we have a trusted partner to deal with there. We deal with the Afghan government, and we have a lot of difficulties with the Afghan government because we're not sure who's corrupt, who's not, and who's, being upfront and who's not. And so therefore we are, flailing around trying to find some trusted interlocutor to help guide us through and to see where informal decision making would thrive and be beneficial to the community. So where I think we can start is by trying to identify the right liaisons, the right people to talk to. One thing I did when I was in Afghanistan, and I realized that, in certain areas, the cultural values that were associated with tradition were so important in particular areas. So rather than just acknowledge it, superficially, I started to talk with judges about how they integrate that themselves. They themselves live in a very traditional box at home, and then they come to court and have other things pulling on them. Some of religious prescriptions and some formal justice prescriptions. How do they deal with that? And they talked to me about how they try and integrate that. And they said, as a judge would say here, well, I'm a human being too. And so I bring with me into my decision making my cultural sort of capital, the thing that I am born and grown up with, and I just do it. It's natural. So we've got to give that same faith to people in those systems. And I identified a couple of judges whom I thought were really interesting, very young Sharia law judges in northern Afghanistan. And I was so fascinated because they were like making decisions based strictly on Sharia law. They had a lot of criticism of cases which decided in favor of in a let's say a domestic dispute, they decided in favor of the male, and so these Sharia law judges would say that's not in accordance to Sharia, and so they would strictly impose the Sharia, and the woman would end up being the person who would be more benefited in that system. And that's what I wanted to emphasize, is the sort of more pure use of the law, which is much more rich than we imagine. And so promoting those younger activist judges, I called them, which is kind of weird because that's not the way we think about it, but they exist. And so it just takes painstaking, it takes a lot of work and time. And I think that's where our problem is. We don't have the time.
As a kind of final question to sum up, I'll ask you to look forward. Do you think there's a tendency in existing attempts to incorporate informal justice to see it as kind of in an instrumental way, as kind of a waypoint on the way to an end state, which is a formal Western system, and kind of see it for what it can provide in the short term? In future state building enterprises, do you think it'll be important to conceive of where the informal mechanisms will fit in a final end state justice system, and how might we do that?
I think trying to look at it in that kind of frame is never going to be successful, unfortunately. And I know it's difficult because that's not the way we think. That's not the way we're trained in Western political science, Western legal thinking. We're not trained to understand that the end product is a result of many things that come in at many different points. And it's interesting because I've also been trained in the legal field in Canada. I went to law school in Canada. I did my postgraduate in Europe, in International Court of Justice. And so for me, I believe that way, except that I've realized that there are other disciplines which we can start to use, anthropology, somewhat sociology, so less legal framework, less political framework, to understand what informal justice is. Okay, to use your framework for a minute, it's probably a source upon which we should draw heavily on in order to understand what the ultimate judicial system in Afghanistan is going to look like, as an example. How much we draw on it in the early days versus the late days, it really depends, but probably more now, which we didn't do. But playing catch up by relying on it a lot more like now, for example, as I said, throwing money at a bunch of tribal justice projects without understanding that, time has gone by and you can't recreate the past. Now you have to look to the future. Looking to the future means look at certain places in Afghanistan, because there are many places that have adopted the formal justice structures, and what they want is they want to continue that way and continue to sort of develop that way. And we have to respect that and go along with that. And there are certain places which still need to feel like their cultural there's cultural cohesion, there's awareness of their values. One thing I do know where we're really lacking, where we could use a lot of, let's say, work, is for people like us to understand more what the values are. Because we talk a lot about the values. You know, I alluded to that when I mentioned this definition of rule of law. But we allude to a lot to values, Afghan values, cultural values. Do we really know what we're talking about? And I'm sorry, we don't. It's very interesting that somebody can, and it's true. I mean, I did it too. Go to Afghanistan, you're implementing a program, and all of a sudden you're an Afghan expert on rule of law and justice. So it's very difficult. We've got to take a look at ourselves too and be humble about what we know.
Thank you very much for the talk.
Thank you.